Hello, everybody. Welcome to our event. This is a disability justice event. My name is Gordon Friesen. I'm president of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. For those who are visually impaired, I'm a aging white guy with most of my own hair, still brown, and a kind of a grizzled beard, which is tending on the gray side. I had my back broken in an automobile accident when I was a young man, 46 years ago. I've been following this subject intensely as long as it's been a thing. And I met up with Alex in 2013, and moving up through the ranks, I'm now president. In any case, the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition is a single issue group which is composed of people from all over the political spectrum. We therefore do not endorse any particular program or philosophy outside of our core mission. It is Meghan Schrader, disability scholar and EPC board member, who has made today's event possible. Disability justice is both a common sense idea and a specific manifesto. Hence, individual EPC members will have their own thoughts on each of those aspects. However, allies of the disability justice movement count among our most committed adversaries. In other words, disability justice activists possess a common conceptual core with people who would otherwise be impossible to approach on this issue. And that's become very important in several very important, tight legislative contests. That ability has tipped the balance in our favor. So it is my pleasure to participate in this EPC-sponsored forum where the ideas of this wing of our coalition will be showcased. And today we are privileged to have with us some very distinguished people. We have Harold Braswell, who understands disability from the direction of the deaf parent, and he specializes, pardon me?
The child of deaf adult.
Exactly. And specializing in death and dying, and has published a book on the crisis of U.S. hospice care. Now, that's a book which very much interests me. I'm going to have to pick up a copy of that. Then we have Keith Jones. Keith is not here yet. Hopefully he will be. And if not, we may have a follow-on event to hear from him. So I will just say that he's an interesting man, president and CEO of Touching Experiences, Soul Touching Experiences, which is advocacy for community living disabled, arts, housing, healthcare, the whole 9 yards. Then today we have Joe Tate, who is also a EPC board member and is in college and vocational program intellectual disabilities and public school special education in the old days. And he's against institutionalization of people with disabilities, active with ADAPT and with Not Dead Yet, very well-rounded experience of our questions today. Andrew Dell'Antonio from the School of Music, that's interesting. Autistic children and a mother with dementia, so direct hands-on experience with what we're talking about.
And he's also a scholar of music history and disability studies.
Yeah, well, as a music buff, I'll bend his ear on that later. So this is all great. These are the people we have. I would like to now begin by just going around the table, starting with all of our guests, and hear from them whatever it is they particularly find personally important. And
about disability and death and how that relates to assisted suicide.
Yeah, their work in anti-assisted suicide advocacy and their personal experience of these things, of course.
Individually, you should call them out then, Gordon, so they can unmute themselves and
Which
then mute themselves, just so you don't have the problem of the interference.
Thank you very much. So we'll begin with Harold. Harold, could you unmute and talk for a little bit?
Sure. So, as first of all, thanks, Meghan and EPC for having me out here. My personal experiences with disability. Okay, sorry a second. Thank you, buddy. Give me a second. Can you come back to me in a second, actually? Sorry.
Okay,
Sure,
well,
sure,
Okay,
sure.
I got a parent for 1 minute.
What if we
Okay.
did Joe next?
okay, so Joe, you're up. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Could you remind me about how much time would you like me to spend?
Well, go ahead.
Okay, got you. Yeah, please let me know.
2 minutes, 3 minutes,
No,
something
no,
like
no. 5 minutes,
5 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes.
but
Great.
whatever you want. But I'll cut you off when the time comes.
Thank you. Please do. Please do. Yes, I'm Joe Tate. I'm lucky enough to have worked with organizations like ADAPT, which are represented there in that black and white photo. Happy to see those folks there. That person right up front with the Access as a Civil Rights poster. That's one of my mentors, Stephanie Thomas, who is with Adaptive Texas. She's actually still advocating today. She'll still go to the Texas Capitol today, and work on disability and justice. So I'm lucky enough to have worked with Adapt. And with my connections with Adapt, I got to be familiar with Not Dead Yet. I think those two groups are very closely linked. And for those that aren't familiar, Adapt is one of the pioneering organizations for all things disability and access. And they were there before the Americans with Disabilities Act. And they're still here today. And they originally pushed for accessible buses, and then they moved on to attendant care. And they've always been tied to this notion that people with disabilities deserve to have access to all the same things that everyone else does. And that often it's not your disability that prevents you from doing things, it's having your accommodations for your disability that prevents you from doing things. So that's always been ADAPT's approach is let's come to the system, and we're not necessarily asking for more, we're asking for not reductions, we're asking for reform. So I think I come at that angle, and I see the institutionalization of people with disabilities as also linked to the assisted suicide movement. This notion that people with disabilities deserve to be segregated and separated for whatever reason, for whatever underlying reasons. But ultimately, what it is, it's a lack of supports and services that cause people to go into institutional settings. And I think, again, it's what people often are not given a choice in their choice in assisted dying. They are coerced into assisted dying, and it's lack of critical supports and services that move and channel people into these types of quote unquote decisions. And I just see, I'm an able-bodied, I meant to say beforehand for those that might have visual needs, I'm an able-bodied white male. I'm tall and lanky. I'm about 6'5". I'm an able-bodied person, but I see this, I know that I won't always be able-bodied. We call in the disability rights movement, they call people like me tabs, temporarily able-bodied. So just like I am likely to face disability, or I will likely face death. And the supports and services around disability and death are not adequate. And I'm personally very frustrated with how society has ordered its priorities on how we fund things. And I think this is largely an argument for me about funding. So I'll just try to tie it all back together real quick. I'm from Texas. And in Texas, we fear dying because dying is a painful thing that is not properly supported. We do not have long-term supports and services. We don't have dignity and death in Texas. But I was lucky enough to go to Minnesota and see my aunt's end of life and to see her in hospice in Minnesota. I'm lucky that we have Harold on. I'm sure Harold knows the drastic difference between hospice services in Texas versus hospice services in Minnesota. And there wasn't the fear around death. And we got to be with her. That was dramatic to me to see the difference that supports and services can make for a family around death. It's the same when it comes to people with disabilities. And we in Texas, I'll just say, and then I'll stop, we have the most institutions of any state in the United States. We institutionalize the most people. And we also have the worst services and supports for people with disabilities. So in Texas, you can wait for 10 or 15 years for your supports and services in the community, or you can be institutionalized tomorrow. And I think there's a bridge there, if you think about it, between this push to assisted suicide versus the supports and services that we as a community might allocate to those folks. But I appreciate being here.
Well, thank you, Joe. That was very concise and educative. Harold, are you okay now? Most important thing is the kids, by the way, Harold.
Yeah,
I got
sorry.
4 of
I'm
them.
sorry about that. It's a snow day today in Missouri, so we're
Oh,
it's not
That's
that big a
great.
house.
That's
Um,
great.
so I'm Harold. I'm a black-bearded white guy, bald. And as Megan put in the slide, my mom was deaf, and she was thrown out of Oralist public schools in New York in the 1950s and didn't learn a language, sign language, until she was 10. And this was a story I grew up with. I was raised by my grandparents, my maternal grandmother in particular, and she was a familial advocate. She had no consciousness of disability rights whatsoever, but she was a strong familial advocate for her daughter. And she told me about how people had treated my mother and our family. And I could see a lot of the impact of that treatment on my mother, even as when I was a child and my mother was in her 40s and 50s. So I had a kind of proto-disability consciousness, but not tied to the disability rights movement, which I literally didn't learn existed until probably I was 23 or 24. I had no consciousness of this. I was in personal psychotherapy at the time, and I began to wonder if my mother might be disabled. I didn't even have that word to attach to her. And when I began to wonder about that, I thought, gee, I should probably read something about this. And I read the first edition of the Disability Studies Reader, and it changed my life. And I realized I wanted to become a disability studies scholar because I realized that this extremely complicated relationship that I had with my mother, and it had everything in it, was mediated by hundreds of years of history, by social and political structures, by everything imaginable. And that it was a relationship that was not just personal, it was also political. And that would have to be part of my mission in life from then on. And so it's been. Now, as it happened, this was in 2003, 2004, a movie called Million Dollar Baby came out, which I'm sure most people on the call remember, but it's a movie about euthanasia. And at the time, the public debate was about whether you should spoil the ending of a movie to say whether it's about euthanasia and whether euthanasia is good or bad. And it occurred along familiar culture wars, left, right, political binaries, okay? I'm a secular Jewish guy from New York, so I was very aware of where I lay on those binaries. I was pro-euthanasia because I'm pro-choice with regard to abortion and I don't have religious commitments. But I was also interested in disability rights, and so I happened to read something Carol Gill wrote, something Paul Longmore wrote, and I realized that I had no idea what I was talking about. And that actually well-meaning, secular, progressive people like me who have the right, notice I'm not using quotes, I think the right, still right views on a lot of issues can be extremely wrong when it comes to disabled people with very violent consequences. And it made me think, actually, and it made me want to think more. So I decided to become a scholar at that point, studying this topic. I went to do a PhD at Emory University, where I worked with Rosemary Garland Thompson, among other amazing scholars, but she's the most prominent disability studies scholar that I worked with. And, I realized that there was a gap in the literature in thinking about terminal illness and specifically the structure of end-of-life care in America and how it applies to this topic. The disability rights critique was very much framed around long-term disability, which makes sense, by the way. So I wanted to study that. I wrote a book about it called The Crisis of U.S. Hospice Care. I still really like this book. I recommend it. Gordon, please read the book. Everyone buy it. Buy it. You don't even need to read it. Just buy the book. Not used. And, in the book, I said something that I don't know what I think about it now, but I basically said, look, we could agree to disagree on this issue in America with regard to terminally ill people. Let's just get a functioning hospice system and all come together on that. And it's going to be a heavy lift because, Joe didn't mention the nursing home system. First, we're going to have to work with long-term care and then hospice. And there's billions of dollars opposing us in this. So it's not like, we actually need collective action on a huge scale, which we have had before in this country, but we need it now on this. And, so it's better not to be divided. So that was me in 2019, pre-Canada. And I think that seeing what's happened in Canada since 2021 has made me much more reluctant to support any sort of assisted suicide, including regarding to terminally ill people in the United States. You got to look at what happened in Canada in 2014. If you had said to people, you're going to be legalizing this for people with depression, people with anorexia in 10 years, people would have said, you're a hysteric. What are you even talking about? Well, the issue is when you raise the floor, you get used to it. And then you kind of start not even to think about this sort of thing. And I am very worried that that could happen in America as well. So that's kind of where I am right now.
Well, that's nice, Harold, because that's your 5 minutes up, but you raised some extremely interesting points that I hope we're going to come back to. So now I'll go on with Andrew. Andrew, if you could
Thank you.
unmute yourself.
So I might as well describe myself as well. I'm also a white man, kind of balding, kind of graying, in my upper middle age. Lots of white men here, and I'm really sorry that Keith Jones isn't here with us today because
Me too.
my
That would have been so cool.
yeah, and he sent an email saying he has his fever. I hope he can join us. I want to sort of underline, though, that those of you who have not read his work, just very recently there was an excellent interview with him where he talks about the importance of thinking about disability along with poverty, along with race, all these axes of oppression, which again, and age is very important too. So my own experience with disability is with both my kids having diagnoses. I also have a disability diagnosis of ADHD, which I received in adulthood. But I'm privileged by the fact that I'm a university professor. I am comparatively well off. My parents were comparatively well off as well. My stepdad also was a university professor. So when my mom became ill and when she gradually developed dementia, she was able to stay at home with people caring. She's in Massachusetts, so again, it'll depend on the state. I'm also in Texas because Megan and Joe and I are all three of us are in the general Austin area. We know each other from that area. And so again, I was able to see how a state like Massachusetts does hospice, which they do very well, but they also do it very well when people have the resources. So I was able to talk to some of the hospice nurses in Massachusetts who were helping with my mom, coming by twice a week to check in on her. And my mom was in hospice a very long time and declined very slowly. She did not speak and had to be helped to eat for the last about year of her life. I don't know how she felt about it because she couldn't convey it. And so I am somebody who struggles also with the question of choice and whether if someone is suffering, if someone is terminally ill in hospice and would like to end their life, if somebody tells me that that is what they want, I would have trouble saying, no, I'm sorry, you can't end your life because I'm not them and I'm not going through their experience. I was blessed by the fact that my mom was getting extraordinarily good care, that as far as we could tell, she was at peace and she was happy, or at least not unhappy, to be in her home with her people. The amount of money that was spent to keep her there was extraordinary. We were blessed to be able to spend it, even in Massachusetts, because again, talking to the nurses there who delivered hospice care in Western Massachusetts, they were telling me about families who did not have as many resources, whose families members were helping with hospice, because in Massachusetts, at least, the idea is you need to have somebody at home caring for you if you're doing home hospice. So that person can be a family member, can be a paid attendant. In our case, it was a combination of people. So we were blessed to have the resources. The question of means, the question of wealth versus poverty, I think is gigantic. It's one of these things that the United States we don't want to talk about very much. In Canada, again, those of you who are in Canada may have a different relationship to this because there's maybe less of a gruesome disparity between wealth and support. But again, and I've talked to people in Canada too, I have relatives and friends there. Medicine there can be good and can be not so good. And of course, the whole MAID program that has been set up as an adjunct to medicine is really horrific. So as someone who is mostly able-bodied in terms of physical health, who has witnessed the aging of a parent who thankfully was able to live her life to the end and was very well cared for, I'm very aware of the financial privileges that we have. And I don't know what would have happened with my mom if they had not had the financial resources, because my stepdad was not in a position to care for her towards the end of her life. So I think one of the things we really need to talk about absolutely has to do with disability, also has to do with financial support, has to do with the fact that governments, when they are supportive, and the U.S. government is not, in Canada maybe a little more, but when they are supportive, they are not sufficiently supportive to ensure that people who do not have means are able to survive and live the way they want to live. And so my interest in disability studies, I'm also a scholar of disability studies. I have not done as much research as some of the folks here, but I've done a fair amount of teaching in disability studies in the context of music and otherwise in culture. And one of the things that is very powerful to me is the reality that in our society, the US society, Canadian society, productivity is good, right? I have some close disabled friends who feel bad that they have to rely on other people's help because they've been taught very carefully that being productive is good and being unproductive is bad. Even some of the most strong disability advocates cannot unteach themselves the fact that if you can't support yourself, then that's a problem. And until our society unlearns that from top to bottom, the fact that everybody deserves the right to live as much and as fully as they can with the support of those around them, be that their families, be that society, be that religious institutions. I personally, I'm not a highly religious person, so my thought is society has a responsibility separate from charity and religion to care for people. But I do have close friends who believe the religious institutions have a very important role in that, and I'll accept that. In the end, we cannot rely on one resource, and until people are truly given the opportunity to live well they want to, then we can't facilitate their death structurally. So
That's
yeah,
I'm
I'll
going to
stop
cut
there.
you off
Thank
there,
you.
that's really you really brought up some very, very interesting things there. Megan, maybe you could say something now because we're missing a
Sure.
panel member.
Great. So I am a white woman with freckles. I have auburn hair that's sort of short. I'm wearing a dark shirt with some roses on it and a necklace. I studied the right to die issue after reading Peter Singer's work in college. I was pretty shocked that he was able to compare people with disabilities to chimpanzees and say that they should die. It reminded me of the hate speech I experienced from bullies growing up. And then I started studying the eugenics movement and seeing parallels between how the eugenics movement treated people with disabilities and some of the experiences I had had as a special education student. And I also just had other interactions with people talking a little bit about the aid and the assisted suicide issue in ways that were very derisive toward people with disabilities. So I've always opposed it. In 2016, unfortunately, I suddenly lost my biological mother to cancer. I'm adopted and I had met her 2 years previously. And that was a really shocking, terrible loss. I also, when she got that diagnosis, I was going into a kind of psychotic depression. So I had to say goodbye to her in that state. So I empathize with people who didn't get the peaceful goodbye that they needed, but I still think having seen just how badly disabled people are degraded every day by the systems around them, having seen how often the systems fail, having experienced coercion myself, just to make various choices that I would not otherwise make because the accommodations for my disability aren't there. I hate to think of some poor person being coerced into killing themselves because they didn't have the support. That would seem to take the ableism that disabled people experience every day to this lethal extreme. So I see assisted suicide as being connected to a spectrum of abuse, even though I do understand that many supporters of the Oregon model, mean no harm. And the fact that they would like to do it is understandable. I don't think everyone who wants to do the Oregon model is hostile to disability rights, but I still think that the social structures to support free choice aren't there, and I think it's inherently creates a situation where people are incentivized to kill themselves because they're burdens, and I think that's degrading and even hateful, even if the person sending that message doesn't intend to be hateful. So those are my thoughts on the issue.
Well, thank you very much, Megan. If I might, it's as a Canadian in our situation where we got to, when a few years ago, nobody would have imagined it. It's as simple as that. One of our people on the panel said that nobody would have imagined this back in 2014. And right now, every one of the interventions we had so far have been the axis has been upon choice, and how can we make it easier for people to choose to live. And those are obviously terrific concerns. What we've learned in Canada is it's not about choice. The medicalized death program is not about choice. It's a utilitarian managed death system. That's what it is. And we're discovering that in real time in Canada. In the United States, you're a little bit behind on that. However, I've just done an analysis on your legislation. And through the years, the legislation is becoming filled up with mandates and entitlements. And mandates and entitlements have nothing to do with choice. Mandates and entitlements are the flip side of prohibition. They are policy instruments to indicate which is the desirable outcome. Okay, so when you go through the mandates and entitlements in progressively coming in, and also the adoption of the MAID definition itself as a medical treatment. I mean, if you delve into medical treatment, you see that the World Health Organization defines medical care as a human right, and which states have an obligation to provide. And so basically, if you take the idea of the universally accepted idea of medical treatment as a positive benefit, which the state has the obligation to provide to the most people possible, and then you see that euthanasia has been defined in those terms, and you look at the numbers that are going on, and can you see where this is going? I mean, choices, it's all very good. I mean, we're going to work on that, and we would like to help one another to choose to live. Definitely, those are our priorities. But we are facing a political ideology which is about, it's unapologetically utilitarian. I mean, if you delve into public health, if you delve into the whole idea of public health care, you will see that their ethics are utilitarian ethics, and they name them as such. And in COVID, we had this thing about who was going to be on the ventilator, who wasn't going to be on the ventilator. And when you see that, like in Canada, where the whole thing is a monopoly and the amount of money that is put in is a political decision, the kind of constant emergency triage is a political decision. And so they leave people without alternatives. But it's not the people anymore that are asking for death. It's not, doctor, could I die? No, that's not what it is. We had a letter the other day from a lady who went to the doctor, and her doctor had never talked with her for more than 1 or 2 minutes before, real quick public service interviews with your doctor now. And in this case, he suggested, well, have you thought about medical aid in dying? And then he went on for like 10 minutes, beaming, extolling how wonderful this would be. Actually, people say, oh, but you can't have the doctor mentioning this to the patients proactively. Well, excuse me, but in medical standard of care, informed consent involves a complete appreciation of all of your options. So for the minute that MAID is a medical option, they have to discuss it. And then you have the enthusiasts who, under the mantle of that, are able to push it to the hilt. So I would like you to think about, as Americans, to start thinking right now about the next step down the road, because the Oregon model won't last. The Oregon model is a cheat. It's a fraud. It is a 50-state strategy. Their idea is to get as many states on board with a minimal program. And when they get to about 50% penetration or a little more, then they'll go over to the expansion program. They shut down California. California had a very viable expansion bill, which would have gone over to almost entirely Canadian criteria. But it was shut down because Compassion and Choices told them to shut it down, because they had New York State and Illinois looming on the horizon. They want to get those over the hill first. So anyway, I'll stop now, but I'm saying, take a look, this one step down the line. Improving the conditions of choice is not going to be the end of this. So
Should we go
now,
on to the next slide?
having said that, I think we should go on with your particular points.
So I thought I could start here. This is something I wanted us to all talk about. Sometimes the proponents contend that disability rights opponents of PAS are a vocal minority. This is not my experience. I, studied this topic from around 2007 until 2016. I once went to on my first time presenting at the Society of Disability Studies, a speaker said that he was an agnostic, but he thought that if there was an afterlife, neither Osama bin Laden or Jack Kevorkian were enjoying it very much, and everyone in the room cheered. And I mean, there's even opponents in some of their writings contradict themselves and acknowledge that, that's the predominant view, even if no community is a complete monolith. So in my experience, this is not a vocal minority, and I would just welcome everybody else to talk about that issue. Who would like to go first? Harold?
Yeah, I mean, Meghan, there's look at Joseph Shapiro's book, No Pity, which is, in my mind, still the best book about disability rights in America or even internationally. He's a journalist for NPR, and he writes it, and you get it after you read his book. You really do understand quite viscerally what disability rights is, and it's sadly still a relevant book because not enough people have gotten it. So its relevance has not died. Well, there's a chapter in this book about Not Yet Dead and disability rights opposition to assisted suicide. So it's not a book about bioethics. It's not a book about niche issues. It's a book about a civil rights movement. And opposing assisted suicide was understood by Joseph Shapiro, who has no reason to care about this issue particularly, as a central pillar of the disability rights movement, alongside the fight against institutionalization, the against harmful behavioral interventions, it's just part of the pillar. So, and that's history, and I think that's true. Now, it is true that there have been people within the disability rights movement who have opposed assisted suicide, and I don't think we should go over that and sort of not talk about their views as well. They make an argument from autonomy, but there's always been a debate within disability rights about, okay, is this autonomy or is it a discriminatory double standard in suicide prevention? Where rather than giving choice, as Gordon was talking about, rather than giving us something more, are you really giving us something less that sits on top of all of the less you're giving us? And disability rights activists have felt that, yeah, there's a tension between a discriminatory double standard and autonomy, but it's not a tension in the abstract. You have to look at the society you live in and how it treats disabled people. And the evidence has been overwhelming that the discriminatory double standard concern should be taken much more seriously than the autonomy concern. So I think, Meghan, you're right within the disability rights movement. One more thing I just want to say. Now, the issue is that, unfortunately, I don't think most people who have a disability identify with the disability rights movement. Like I told you my story, right? Like my mom was deaf. We knew about this. I had no idea. I was born in 1981. I had no idea the ADA, which passed when I was 9 years old, by the way. I had no idea about it until I was 24. There's just not a lot of disability consciousness. So it may be true that among people who have a disability that would qualify them for MAID, there are many, many people who might support it. But among people who identify with the disability rights movement, I think you're right, Meghan, and I don't think it's particularly close.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't shock me Harold's right. I mean, the disability justice movement is not highly visible. People internalize a lot of ableist ideas. Autonomy is a highly valued thing in our culture. And there are a lot of statistically disabled people have a high suicide rate. So it wouldn't be shocking if the proponents could find a lot of people who would like to kill themselves. Go ahead, Andrew.
Following up on what you just said and what Harold just mentioned, first of all, just in my own perspective, disability justice and disability rights are two very different things. But certainly, people who identify as disabled and who are cognizant of the fact that as disabled people they are a discriminated against class, I think those folks generally do not support assisted suicide except for, like you say, Megan, in desperation circumstances. So because they have been prevented from living essentially in a functional way, then they might feel like dying. But that, as we've been saying all along, that's not an excuse. That's a problem society needs to solve, is the fact that disabled people feel like their life is not worthwhile because of society, not because of who they are. I think it is true, though, and I appreciate what Harold said about this, is that there are a lot of people whose differences, disabilities, whose impairments don't disable them socially, right? The whole social model idea where whatever difference you have in your body or mind, you do not perceive it as being different than, you don't perceive yourself as being oppressed by society. You just, you want to be more productive or this or that, the other thing. And so those folks might in fact try to distinguish themselves from the people who are not productive, and might even be willing to accept that people who are non-productive should be allowed to commit suicide. So this is, I mean, a lot of this is ableism, ableism, and also the privilege of people who are not, in fact, exposed to the harms of ableism as structurally, right? They may eventually be, but in the moment they may not be. So thank you, Harold, for that point. Is there are a lot of people who are impaired who, in fact, would benefit from a bit of more cognizance of how disability affects us all and in intersectional ways, but who might want to think of themselves as non-disabled. And I'm sure, Harold, I have a couple of deaf friends that the whole deaf community has a whole interesting relationship with that, right? Because a lot of people do talk about being deaf but not disabled. So the whole question of should disabled people who are those kinds of disabled people be allowed to kill themselves, but people who are okay, actually, whose minds are okay, people use this all the time, should be helped, right? They can be productive. Those who cannot be productive, well, maybe they should be allowed. And that, I think, that moment is a real perilous moment of disconnection between, of dehumanization of people who are disabled the wrong way. So I think this is really a really thick problem.
I have actually studied this a little bit and the numbers, okay, and it actually surprised me. When I started out, I believed that 20% of the people in my case would commit suicide. That was the number that was commonly bandied around, was 20%. Well, imagine when I actually started studying it that I realized that 1% was the actual number. And when Meghan Schrader talks about, well, we have a high rate of suicide, that this goes back to what the misconception that I had. But you see, it's because suicide is counted in like 10 in 100,000. All right. So let's say you go 4 times that rate. Well, then you're talking about 40 in 100,000. You understand what I'm saying? You have to get up to 1,000 to be 1%. I mean, it's extraordinary how few people commit suicide so we think, okay, 5 times the threat means that there's a huge number of suicide. It's not true. The actual fact is, like I said, in the case of catastrophic injury of all kinds, it's 1% in the first 5 years. After that, no difference with the standard. Like if you survive 5 years, you will have no statistical difference with the rest of the population. It's just amazing. That just blew me away. It's totally surprised me. Okay, so that's one indication. Second indication, when we had Bill 21, it was Bill 17 in 2021, to extend it to people who are not dying, we, in the briefs that we presented to Parliament, there was not one that was presented by a disabled individual that was in favor of that bill. Okay, let that settle in. We had a joint collective letter above and beyond the different briefs that were presented. It had 147 national disability organizations on that list signing that open letter. There was nobody opposed. There is nobody.
You mean nobody
opposed.
supported?
Nobody's supporting assisted death. Exactly. So it's just an amazing thing. So you see the difference between, okay, the way I define it is the difference between Democratic support, public approval measured as democratic support, public approval measured as real demand. Okay. Now the real demand is minuscule. In Canada right now, I mean, it's a terrible thing. We had 16,000 people last year, 16,000 in a population the same as California, where they have like 400. But in any case, the 16,000, when you go to the worst category is terminal cancer. Terminal cancer was a consent rate of 10%. So in the worst possible circumstances, 1 in 10 people will consent because it's now proposed to everybody. 1 in 10 people will. It's totally against any kind of human instinct to die. So nobody does it. Nobody wants to do it. So basically, in terms of real demand, there is no real demand. This is being imposed upon us. Okay. And it is being imposed upon us. And of course, you talk about interiorization of ableist criteria. Well, there you go right away. You think, oh, yes, it's understandable. No, it's not understandable. It is not understandable. It is pathological. There are a small number of people who want to commit suicide, and some of them happen to be disabled.
Yeah.
That's the
Joe,
other thing you have
what
to
was-
realize.
Should we have Joe comment? He hasn't commented yet.
I appreciate you, Megan, looping me in. No, it's hard to piggyback off that. I think there's some insightful things. I love hearing the data. I mean, that's my sense, right? Of what Gordon's saying is that's kind of my sense, but that's not what you hear. And I think part of what maybe some of the underpinning of why disability rights are so opposed to assisted suicide is that if you are connected to disability rights, you understand that when these mechanisms are put into place, it becomes a machine that grinds human beings down and treats them as a crop. I mean, we've talked about eugenics, we've talked about entitlements, we've talked about funding, right? The eugenics movement started in America. That machine that treated human beings as less than started in America. And here in Austin, we still have an institution that was created over 100 years ago based on the model of eugenics. I think that when people that are aware of the systems in place for people with disabilities, they can see, we talk about the horizon, what's coming. They understand that when the machine is in place, there's no stopping it. We still, like, again, we have institutions today, Austin State Supported Living Center, that has been around since before Adolf Hitler, before the Nazis, was created to separate and sterilize people. And it's still there today, providing services to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, not because they choose to be there, but because they are forced by the services, the systems that are in place for people. And we talk about choice. You have to wait 15 years to get services and supports in a community setting in Texas. There is no waiting list to go to the state supported living centers. You can go. So, and we talk about entitlements. We call them waivers here, community supports and services. We call them waivers, Medicaid waivers. Why do we call them waivers? It's because you are waiving your entitlement to a nursing home or institution. This is still built in back before we had Medicaid, before we expected people with disabilities to ever live in the community, before we had occupational therapists and physical therapists and the ADA to help with the structural supports. That is still in play. We call it a waiver. You're waiving your right, your entitlement to a nursing home or institution. So I think that's what we really need to understand as advocates and also as just community members, is that once these systems are in place, they're going to be incredibly hard to dislodge. And I really do. I think we can always bring it back to funding too. And just, for me, I just get so frustrated with the amount of money that we spend elsewhere as a society. And I don't think anyone should tell us, oh, we don't have enough. We've got a budget. We've got a budget. I just looked it up out of curiosity. The Canadian military budget is way up. Y'all are going to spend over $80 billion over the next 5 years. Think about what that could do to prevent people from having to choose, those tens of thousands of people in Canada that are choosing death. Think about if we invested $80 billion into housing and into mental health supports and community funding and personal care attendance. Think about what it could change the landscape in the dialogue. But you're locked in, guys. The system's in place. They're going to increase that military budget and they're going to take it from somewhere else. And when you go to your politicians and ask them for help, they're going to say, well, where are we going to cut from? Where do we take this money from? So, anyways, I think that's
Yeah.
part of the reason why it's such a universal pushback against this, and why you don't see any disability rights organizations run by people with disabilities that support this, because they understand how dangerous it is. But
Harold wanted to say something.
No, I was just clapping at what Joe was saying. I thought it was great. This is specifically the point about once you build things, it changes reality. That there's a huge difference between something existing as an idea and existing as an actual policy. Once it becomes a policy, there's so much work that goes into it, and just the whole system. It tilts towards inertia, towards keeping that in place. We see this with hospice, by the way, which I study. The Medicare hospice benefit in 1982, 1983. It has a lot of positive things, but the defining feature of it is it's basically impossible to change. There just hasn't been anything approaching the political will. So we have to be very thoughtful and very, very afraid about what we're building right now and take it very seriously. So I just agreeing with what Joe said.
Awesome. Should we move on to the next slide? There we go. Okay. So I thought we could talk about risks of MAID for disabled people who are members of other marginalized groups. Now, again, I'm really frustrated that Keith Jones could not be here. He would have been amazing. He works with Crip Hop Nation, which is a group that works disability into hip hop music, and he's done all these amazing things with Soul Touch and Experiences, which is another organizations that helps disabled people find resources, and he's done a lot of intersection with disability justice. But from speaking with him and other people in the disabled community who are members of the BIPOC community or who have experienced poverty, the general consensus is that the structural mechanisms in place in society that push BIPOC persons or poor people or other marginalized groups toward bad life outcomes would also be operative in the practice of assisted suicide and would exacerbate the coercion that people with disabilities already face. It would be kind of a double whammy. So I was just thinking we could have a discussion about that. Perhaps you could start it off, Harold.
Sure. Well, so actually I want to start off, so Heather Hancock, who's part of our illustrious audience. So thank you. So posted something really important in the chat. So I'll just summarize it, but she's talking about being a 57-year-old Canadian woman who has lived with cerebral palsy for her entire life, and she's had to fight for accommodations and to not be institutionalized her entire life. And she began working with EPC fighting against MAID in Canada before it was legalized. Now, almost 10 years later, I've been coerced 3 times while being hospitalized by 2 doctors and 1 nurse to take MAID because they decided my level of suffering was not tolerable. I told them they have no right to determine that and that my answer is no and always will be because my life has intrinsic worth and value. I'm going to stop right there because I want to emphasize that last part. What does it mean to say that life, everyone's life, okay, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of disability, has intrinsic worth and value? It can seem like a very conservative argument or religious argument. Maybe it is. Maybe those things aren't bad. But for me, it's actually something that's really important if we're going to care about and create a society that welcomes people who are at these intersections that we're talking about, people who fall not through one crack, but multiple cracks. To have a sense of their intrinsic value and to say that we're going to take killing off the table, that it's not going to be part of this discussion, is sometimes all members of these groups might have to support them, okay, in what are otherwise very violent circumstances. I became aware of this issue. I have to say it's a little bit embarrassing, but most fully through my engagement with Canadian activists, members of First Nations groups. Indigenous activists, the Indigenous community in Canada, in my understanding, has been extremely opposed to medical aid in dying. Guess what? They've been dealing with a suicide crisis caused by centuries of colonialism. And so now their elders are going to end up in the hospital and they're going to get offered, hey, do you want to take your life? So the offer of suicide gets layered on top of what is already a suicide epidemic caused by colonialism. So ableism is part of the colonial structure, as I understand their argument, which makes a lot of sense to me and is a very powerful and compelling argument. So it's just one example of how this could work. And I think, to Heather's point, it's not Heather's only point, but, to say at a basic level, look, we're just not going to do this. We're going to take this off the table. We're going to accept that every person has an intrinsic value and worth. And you know what? People with disabilities, it can sometimes be complicated to get them the services and supports they need. And that could be even more the case when they also experience racism and poverty and other things. We can't, we have to work with those complexities. And for me, taking killing off the table is a starting point for doing that work and is really important.
I was thinking that Andrew could comment next. Are you on there, Andrew?
He mentioned he had to parent, so he might be.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
I just wanted to say with regards to that. No, I'll wait. We can go on.
Well, what would you like to say about it, Joe?
I think Harold really nailed on some important points, and I appreciate reading Heather's story as well. I think we all understand that as this is rolled out, those folks are going to be the ones that are targeted, are going to be the ones that are exposed to this type of service the most. So they are definitely at risk. And I know we've talked a lot about just kind of lack of general supports and services. I don't know why, but what came to mind, maybe I'm just focused on this today. I just thought of that Martin Luther King quote that said, a nation that spends more year after year on war than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And, I know Martin Luther King really, especially towards the end, tried to say like we were going to have, it's not just, a black person movement. It's it's all the folks, the poor folks movement. And I think, yeah, if these underserved populations are definitely at the highest risk. But what came to mind?
Directly with regards to the inherent value of life, which as a religious concept is the sanctity of life. That's why it's been rejected. It's been rejected in public discourse because it's attached to the religious background of sanctity of life. But I look at that and I say to myself, okay, in terms of an entirely mechanical world, you'd say, all right, we have no proof of this or proof of that. But if we want to have a civilized society, we shouldn't really care whether there is a truth about the inherent value of human life, whether human life actually matters in the universe in universal terms. If we want to function as a human society, I think it's incumbent upon us to immediately declare that we recognize in one another an inherent worth. Because otherwise, what are you going to base your civilization upon? And I have some very thoughtful secular friends who agree with that entirely. But for some reason, the opposition is able to basically declare that concept off limits. And I don't think it should be off limits because I think it's a social necessity.
Yeah, I would say, like, just to quickly jump in there, I think it's pretty mindless to simply dismiss the idea that everybody's life has value as religious. I mean, the idea that everyone's life has value has had the underpinnings of civil rights advocacy for, decades. It's all about recognizing our common humanity and preserving our lives and like letting people flourish. If you don't have an equal right to be alive because, you're living in a society where there's no support and the doctor romanticizes assisted suicide and sells it to you at every doctor's appointment, then it kind of undermines every other right that you have. If you're not alive, then you can't have your right to a wheelchair, your right to an education, your right to anything else. So when proponents simply deride it as a religious concept, they're kind of going off their own religion, which is autonomy. They see autonomy as kind of the equivalent of their Bible or their religion. But I think in a reasonable society, we compromise. We don't take our ideologies to extremes. We come to a middle that meets everyone's needs, which sometimes includes constraints on autonomy this is the discussion about the marginalized groups, in order to respect the well-being of people who have fallen through the cracks, whether that be due to ableism, racism, both, poverty, etc. All right, should we go on to the next?
Just say, Megan,
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
The autonomy thing, okay? Discrimination is not based on autonomy, okay? They don't discriminate against me because I chose to be discriminated against. They discriminate against me because they want to discriminate against me. And it's the opposition to inherent value of the human being is baked into the cake of utilitarian ethics. That's what utilitarian ethics is. It's the idea that we must seek the greatest possible aggregate good. And that means people can be sacrificed. People can be sacrificed. Groups can be sacrificed. All kinds of things can be done. And they decided that the non-profitable sectors of society, that they were going to suppress that. And it was a very, very well articulated argument coming up through the 20s, through the 30s, through the financial crisis, particularly when people were starving. And they say, well, why are we feeding these people that are worth nothing? And then so it got up to about 33% just before the war. And then after the war, it fell apart to nothing. But now it's coming back.
Yeah. Okay, so should we move on to the next topic?
Yes.
Okay. So I thought we could talk about how autonomy can be complexed or undermined by oppression. I'll just briefly start off. I saw a lot of this in the special education system, with people with learning or intellectual disabilities being pushed toward classes that would not prepare us for college or even any vocational training, just this sort of attitude that we belonged in these lower levels, and seeing how the system was set up to promote that. Like, for instance, when I was going to school in the late 1990s and early 2000s, special education teachers weren't required to be qualified in the subjects they provided intervention in. So my parents had to hire me a tutor, which they couldn't have done if we didn't have enough money. Also, our state of Massachusetts lowered a maximum feasible benefit standard for special education student achievement to the FAPE sum benefit standard, which is a quite low standard. And the school system interpreted that to mean that you had to be achieving at a very low level to get your accommodations. And this also allowed personnel to try to bully very aggressively disabled special education students away from opportunities like college, which is what would be called a social death. This undermines autonomy because you have a bunch of systemic factors pushing you towards a choice that you wouldn't otherwise make. So, for example, I had to file a complaint with the United States Board of Education Office for Civil Rights. That was really my only choice in my own situation. So very clearly, there are times when the system pushes people towards a choice that they really didn't want, and they would have made a different one if only the supports were there. But apathy toward the disabled people, the creation of systems that give more power to the able-bodied service workers than the disabled people because of apathy and wanting to save money, push people towards choices. And I would say that MAID assisted suicide takes that to a lethal extreme of I've oppressed you in all other aspects of life, and now I also think that maybe you should die. So I was wondering what everybody else thought about that. Maybe Harold, you want to go first?
Well, so I think we need to talk about Reed Davenport's movie Life After, which, we could talk for a very long time about how Hollywood and the film industry has been absolutely violent and horrific on this topic, at least since Million Dollar Baby. So when we get an outstanding documentary that illustrates what Megan is talking about, I think we also need to kind of really cheer for it. This is a documentary about Elizabeth Bouvet. So Elizabeth Bouvet, if you know her case, is basically a textbook bioethics case about, a woman, a disabled woman who had wanted to be removed from quote unquote life-sustaining treatment and end her life, and was denied this by the state of California. And then she disappears from the public eye. So Reed follows her and really provides context of her life story about what led her to seek to end her life, and also what happened to her after she was denied this right. And I don't want to spoil the ending, but let me just say, like, it's a great work of art that shows how the history of institutionalization and of the persistent denial of every sort of opportunity, whether it's educational, to have a romantic relationship, to be with other people, can really drive someone to this. And then all that gets erased when they get put on a pedestal and made into the heroine of the Right to Die movement. So it's incredibly powerful, and I think everyone should see it.
Awesome. Joe, what
You know
did you want to comment on that?
Gordon, did you have something there? I heard.
No,
I
I
think
was,
we
I
were-
Or
was,
Gordon,
I,
whichever.
I was just going to say that we should start thinking about going into our question period, but
Mhm.
let's listen to Joe first.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. I'll just say quickly. I mean, I think oppression is is easy. I think that sounds weird to say maybe out loud, but having power over somebody versus having power with somebody is a lot easier. So I think that just again, we've talked a lot about just how the systems of support and how things are set up. It's structured to have power over others, and to not look for areas where we can share power and look to other strengths, not their weaknesses, and to find opportunities for others to continue to learn and contribute. Um, I think that that notion of some people not being able to contribute is asinine. I think everybody in their own way can contribute to a community, to a family, to education, to learning. As a teacher, I know it's difficult to not have power over people, but I know the importance of sharing power with others, especially people who are still struggling with what it means to take risks. And we know, yeah, I think a lot of us in this disability world have heard the term, there is dignity in risk. So if we're not allowing others the right to have choices in their life, then they're not being able to take their own risks, right? It's only the risk that we deem worthy. So, yeah, I think it's massive. I mean, I think it underpins everything. Me as from an educator standpoint, and I know I talked a lot about Texas and how systems are set up, but in the special education system, I'll just say it's a very sad place. And most teachers don't have any expectations that students in special education will ever do anything in Texas. And we talk a whole lot about graduating to the couch. And I think just having higher expectations or an expectations that people can do more or be more can trickle down and have massive amounts of effects on how supports and services are organized for others. So that's just some of my thoughts.
Oh, one more thing. We have one more slide on that we should briefly address some of the changes that are happening in the United States social structure. Just and we'll try to abbreviate that because we want to keep our time reasonable. And then we could go into questions, but I definitely want to briefly mention some of those changes if that's all right.
Okay, well, let's do that then.
Okay, so the last topic is, are recent or proposed USA policy changes likely to make assisted or unassisted suicide more likely? Now, if you look at the screen, there's a disabled Venn diagram, which basically talks about all of the systemic things that people with various levels of disability experience. not disabled enough versus too disabled. And if you look at the picture after on the recording, you'll see that at the bottom it says there's always assisted dying if you can't hack it anymore. So unfortunately, at this moment, it strikes me that there are some USA policy changes that are likely to make both assisted and unassisted suicide more likely, especially if we went to the Canadian model, such as radical changes to the special education system, proposed modification of a requirement that federal buildings, new construction on federal buildings be accessible, proposed removal of Rehabilitation Act incentives for employers to hire disabled people, massive reductions at the Rehabilitation Services Administration, stalling of higher standards for wheelchair handling by airlines, nixing of plans to eliminate sub-minimum wages, and executive orders that encourage institutionalization of people who are mentally ill. Now, those aren't the only changes, but I thought we should just sort of briefly mention them because I think we can clearly see from Canada that the lack of disability rights infrastructure, it's generally, I think you could argue, is worse than the United States. And it would strike me that these changes that are being proposed would make us more like Canada and increase the risk of regular suicide and also push people whose life-limiting disabilities with life-limiting disabilities toward the Oregon model. And then if the Canadian model were ever instituted in the United States, it would exacerbate these new conditions would exacerbate that problem significantly. And it also strikes me that all of these policy changes and assisted suicide are connected by a common pattern of apathy. So I was just wondering if we could just briefly talk about that maybe for 5 minutes. Harold, do you want to go first?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is also, it's more of a transition to the Q&A period too, but like I think it piggybacks on what you said, Megan. So I actually want to take up something that Ruth Enns posted in the chat very, very powerfully, where she's talking about being, who's been opposed. She's tried to tell people close to her about the negative facts about MAID, but inevitably I'm either ignored, patronizingly placated, or shouted down with my body, my choice. Nobody else is affected, so butt out. I'm come to the conclusion that we're trying to fight emotion with facts. And it's very powerful. Thank you, Ruth. I want to respond to this and sort of bring it into what you're talking about, Megan, because I think that, Ruth is writing about being shouted down. And one thing that I would say, though, is that it's important to note that, in my opinion, the tide is actually shifting in terms of this discussion. I want to draw everybody's attention to the Atlantic Monthly, which is not a pro-life marginal Christian magazine. It's not a radical leftist disability rights magazine. It's a normie magazine. It's a magazine that normal, kind of somewhere between middle and highbrow people read in America. And they just published a couple months ago a very long article called Canada is Killing Itself by Elena Plot Calabro. That is extremely, in my opinion, critical and on point about what's going on in Canada. And for me, this is a new chapter in the history of the discussion of the right to die in the United States. That this article, because the Atlantic, I think 5 years ago just would have published a pro-assisted suicide article. Like that would be the normal thing to do, but it's shifting very powerfully. And I think it's really important that it continues shifting and that we continue working on it, because I think, Megan, underpinning what you're saying is stuff is bad right now, and it's very tempting to despair. And I wouldn't blame anyone for despairing and sort of turning to cynicism in some way. And a concern that I have, and it dovetails, in America right now, the legal system changing with economic factors, climate change, like all of these things, it just seems so impossible to do the changes that we need. And so the despair is there as a temptation. And I worry about that being a context in which assisted suicide is legalized, actually, that, it is going to be hard to make the changes that we need to make. But we can't give in to despair, and we can't give up. And I actually want to quote something from this article in The Atlantic that for me terrifies me. I don't know if I could do, can I do a screen share actually? No, I can't do a screen share. Don't worry about it. I'll read it. Okay. So it's basically, it's talking about this doctor in Canada talking about a track 2 patient who had to cancel his scheduled euthanasia. So this is somebody who wants to get euthanized for a disability, track 2. As a result of a motorcycle accident, the man could not walk. Now blind, he was living in a long-term care facility and rarely had visitors. He had been persistent in his request for MAID. But when his family learned that he'd applied and been approved, they started visiting him again. And it changed everything, the doctor, whose last name is Rivard, said. He was in contact with his children again. He was in contact with his ex-wife again. He decided, no, I still have pleasure in life because the family, the kids are coming. Even if I can't see them, I can touch them and I could talk to them. So I'm changing my mind. Okay, so this is a case of somebody who wanted MAID and now his family is there and he's changed his mind. I asked Rivard, the doctor, whether this turn of events, the apparent plasticity of the man's desire to die, the fact that it changed so quickly, had given him pause about approving the patient for MAID in the first place. Not at all, he said. I have no control on what the family was going to do. And I guess I want to come to that last quote. I have no control over what the family is going to do. Actually, you could have picked up the phone and asked the family to go there. Now, that's not part of one's job description as a doctor, but that is something that we have the ability to do. We have the ability, when encountering someone in a despairing circumstance, to understand that it's an emergency, and we might have to step out of our professional roles and take drastic action in order to help give them a reason to live. And I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind right now, given the factors that Meghan's talked about and the despairing situation in general in America and around much of the world, that we can't give into this and we don't need to give into this. It's going to be hard, but I think there are ways forward.
All right, Joe, did you want to comment?
I think that's very well said. I like the hopeful undertone. I mean, I know we all have a call to arms, and I know it's it's difficult. I don't have a silver bullet per se on how to help with the argument of facts over emotions, and I'm aware of that story, and I actually shared it with some of my family, Harold, and I have what I would consider progressive family members here in Texas, and my family's response was, "Wow, I didn't know it was that bad, but." I didn't know it was that bad, but I still want it for myself, right? I still want to be able to have that autonomy. I want to still have that option. So I know, I mean, but I love the tone of hope. I think you're right. I think it comes down to those individual actions. I think it comes down to showing up. I think it comes down to speaking up, even though we feel like we're always going to get shut down. It's still the right thing to do to speak up and to try to anchor it for folks, because not everyone is from the disability justice or disability rights movement, and they may not understand how dangerous it is. And I think it's worth speaking out. I worry that just the deluge of badness is wearing us down, and that this is going to really be snuck in and accelerated more. I mean, I know I've talked a lot about war, but I'll point easily to, here in the United States, we have abolished the Department of Education and we have created the Department of War. I worry, are into a new imperialist phase where programs of social uplift and things that build communities and connections are being actively destroyed all around us. I think it's dangerous time. So, but yes, it's these little moments when we speak up kindly and with empathy. We share what we know. We visit our loved ones if they're sick or they're hurt or we know they're hurting. We reach out to those. I think now more than ever, it's going to be important that we do. But yeah, I know there's probably other questions.
Okay,
Well,
let's move on to the question
we
and
could take
answer.
questions from other participants. People have been watching.
Let me go on to that. Okay.
If anybody
right.
watching would like to express themselves, that would be nice. You just have to unmute your microphones. And really, you don't have to wait for a formal invitation. Just unmute your microphone if you'd like to say something and go ahead. I know some have already done so in the chat, but you can do so right now as well.
Hi, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, brilliant. Sorry.
That's Sophie, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for this really, really interesting. For me, it's the evening. I'm in France, and I had a question. I was really interested in one of the speakers. I'm sorry, I can't remember who was making a really interesting links between assisted suicide and suicide in indigenous communities. And I was wondering if they could speak a bit more about that, about the risks of assisted suicide legislation increasing suicide rates. I'm
You want to
interested.
take that, Harold?
I'm interested because here in France and also in the UK where I'm from, obviously, legislation is going through, and it seems really worrying to me, and I'm interested in learning more from other countries.
So that was, hi Sophie, I'm Harold. And I'll put my email in the chat, and I could also send you some news stories about this. I just want to say I am definitely not an expert on this. It was to my slight embarrassment that when I got on these calls with Canadians, that there were a large, these are very diverse calls actually in Canada that I had, and there were a lot of First Nations people and disability rights activists, or just kind of Indigenous rights activists on them. And I think two things are an important part of this conversation. One is, in Canada, it's been called medical aid in dying. Now, I actually wrote an article called In Defense of quote unquote a physician-assisted suicide, which is not a defense of the act of physician-assisted suicide, but it's a defense of using that term. That we actually have to talk about this in terms of suicide. And you could debate this in terms of America, because there's an argument that terminally ill people are dying anyway. But right now, in terms of Canada, there should be no debate about this. We're talking about people who are not dying in any sense. That's what got legalized in Canada,
Yeah.
in 2021. And so it was very much understood by Indigenous activists, in spite of this euphemistic and inaccurate term, to be about suicide, that it's about legalizing and radically expanding the scope of people who would have access to the means of ending their own life, could actually have their life ended by a medical professional, would be offered that as an option, as a legitimate medical choice, not as a crisis that we need to do everything possible to avoid, but just as one option among many. And that you're offering this to a community that has had a centuries-long crisis, that includes suicidality as being a part of it. So that's how I understood the argument. I want to say again, I'm definitely not a scholar of this, so it's very broad brush. I'll put my email in the chat. If you want to email me, I'll send you these news articles that do provide some context. But it was specifically this concern of, an elder shows up at the hospital, and I think Gordon talked about it, or, actually the people who have written in the chat, you're offered this as another option. And if you're already feeling suicidal, you might just be much more inclined to take it. And that's not good.
No.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't. Thank you so much. Maybe you don't. You're not aware of the answer on this, but when I was looking more closely at some of the MAID kind of protocols, it seemed like they were saying that the Canadian government was saying that there are safeguards in place and that would never be the case. Would you say that's not correct?
Well, if I can answer as the Canadian on the panel, it's absolutely, the whole idea of safeguards is ludicrous.
Yeah.
When you present MAID as a medical treatment, which is a positive medical benefit, and you're proactively proposing it to someone, what kind of safeguards can you have? But I'd like to say something about suicidality. There's been an ongoing discussion about whether or not enabling assisted death would reduce ordinary suicide, because they're saying people who are committing suicide now, they wouldn't be doing that. They wouldn't have to be found by their children hanging in the barn, for instance. You see, this was one of the arguments they used. And in actual fact, it seems that ordinary rates of suicide are stable or, in fact, in some cases, marginally increased in jurisdictions which have legalized assisted suicide. So that's a very strange thing.
Mm.
But it's like a suicidal contagion thing. It's like, culturally saying, quit while you're ahead, And
Yeah.
the thing about this people who are dying and people who are not dying, actually the category of people who are not dying in Canada is quite small. It's only 4.4% of all assisted deaths that are performed. But it's a very important group because it legitimizes euthanasia for people who are suffering.
Yeah.
You see, and suffering can be psychological. So what we're
Yeah.
arguing in Canada right now is euthanasia for people for whom psychological distress is the only underlying condition. And then if you come back, and that's a huge category, and that's really the people who before were trying to commit suicide, and we were stopping them from committing suicide. Now we'll be killing them. And to bring that back to the Indigenous thing, yes, in Canada we have a lot of Indigenous people. It's not like the United States. I
Yeah.
mean, the United States, they were basically Indigenous people were almost entirely pushed out. But in Canada, like the province that I grew up, 20%, that's 1/5 of the province is Indigenous. And there's another province that's almost 50%. So you can imagine. Anyhow, these people are going through an incredible social transition, in their collectively and personally. So they have a suicide epidemic among young people, which is just astounding. I mean, the numbers are just through the roof. So they're looking at this and they're saying, right now, imagine that we have euthanasia for psychological condition and we have this suicide contagion among our youth. I mean, that's just going to be an astounding situation. But then once again, people make this distinction between people who are really dying and people who aren't really dying. You go into your doctor's office, you get a cancer diagnosis. You're told that you're going to be dead in 3 years. Okay. You're going to be depressed right then and there. You're going to be, you're going to be hit hard. And at the same time, he offers you MAID. All right. The idea is systematically attempting to systematically steal the last year or two of life of all of these patients for monetary concern, And like I said, there's only 10% that are going to agree. Even under those circumstances, 90% are going to disagree. So imagine what that means. It doesn't mean that people are choosing MAID because they're suffering more than somebody else. They're suffering because for some reason or other, they have a psychological propensity or they're in for some other reason or whatever it is, but they're in a category that they will say yes. They're in a small group that will say yes, but it has nothing. There is no medical circumstance in which it's normal for someone to want to die. It's as simple as that.
Was there any other questions?
Well, I want to congratulate all of us then, because I want to say that we are the canaries in the coal mine. Okay, we're the ones that survive long enough to think about these things and establish rationale around them. Whereas someone, like I said, again, in the terminal condition, they come in a couple of years, they're done. But someone like, well, myself, I've been here for 47 years. I've been thinking about these things. So we've had the ability to develop a theoretical foundation around what we're doing. But it is a utilitarian collective program, and it threatens us. It threatens that basis of worth of the human life, which I believe civilization is based upon, and so we must oppose it with all
So
we can.
before we close out, does anyone else have any thoughts that they wanted to share? Like Joe or Harold, did you want to share anything else in particular?
I would just, share. Well, first of all, thanks to everybody, and
So
just one more quick reference. So there's a Japanese movie called Plan 75 that I'm going to put a link into the Guardian, a Guardian article about it. Guardian, again, not exactly a conservative right-wing newspaper, but that really did approve of this movie that's about a public policy in Japan. That the movie starts with actually a hate crime against elderly people in Japan. So Japan is a country that the demographic curve is very skewed. There's a very large aging population. And in the movie, a hate crime against elderly people, based in real life, by the way, leads to say, well, we should, rather than having these sporadic hate crimes, let's actually institutionalize a policy where when people turn 75, they could become eligible for euthanasia. It's called Plan 75. And that's what the movie is about. It's people remark that it's a strange movie. I do think that it's quite a poignant and strange and beautiful movie. Again, it's a work of art. It's not propaganda, but it is a movie that I highly recommend. And again, to sort of take hope in this, that actually I see things moving. It's kind of weird to say, but in some ways in a positive direction. There are many negative things, but there are also very positive things that weren't happening again 10 years ago or something like that. So I recommend Plan 75 as well as read Davenport's film Life After.
Awesome. So did
Sophie
you
just
have any
wrote,
closing thoughts?
Sophie just wrote something in the chat. Maybe you should like to expand on that again, Sophie.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, yeah,
sure.
Sophie.
No,
Yes,
no, no.
Sophie.
It just was really another question, but I've already asked questions, so I put it in the chat.
So I'll put it's a great question. So the question is, it seems like in the monitoring statistics that some of the reasons for MAID in both track 1 or 2 could be despair, but named otherwise. So language is really being misused. Yeah. So Sophie, the Atlantic article, I'll put this in there, is exactly about that. It's about people who, I think this kind of dovetails with what Gordon was talking about, that like sort of you get a diagnosis that makes you MAID eligible. But that diagnosis is not in a simple way the thing that might lead you to want to end your life. And actually, people can use even diagnosis for terminal illness to seek out MAID that's driven more by longstanding suicidal ideation, depression, despair, a number of things. In the Atlantic article, there's an example of a guy who was diagnosed with cancer that's treatable, but then refuses treatment, even though it's not a particularly obviously all cancer treatment is onerous, but this is a treatable cancer, and he refuses it because he's dealing with emotional struggles. He doesn't want to live, and that can get snuck in. So yes, Sophie, to your point, it's it's quite tricky and can be quite sinister. Actually, the monitoring of this.
Yeah.
And you also have a basic in terms of the disabled community. When the disabled community becomes eligible for MAID in the United States, this whole question goes up 100-fold, because like somebody like me, my survival depends on basically an iron discipline, which I've carried on for many, many years. Now, if my wife were to leave me, if I was to have a financial disaster of some kind, if I had a child that died, all of these things, right? Say all of a sudden you look at life differently. I could at that moment say, oh, I've had enough with living with this disabled life, but it wouldn't be for that reason. So this would it's huge. It's huge what it opens up at that point.
Joe, did you have any closing thoughts?
Maybe I can help close. I thought it was interesting, the discussion about the indigenous community, why they are resistant to this, and it brought to mind. I know the ADAPT organizers organized a lot with the indigenous community here in the United States, because they were so reluctant and resistant to the notion of nursing homes, that we should send our elders, these beloved members of our society and our community, that we should separate them, or that it is no longer our obligation as community members to care for those around us. So I thought that was interesting, and maybe that's the notion of hope. I know Harold has talked a lot about hope, but maybe that's the notion of hope, is that's where we can help folks the most, is to work to build a sense of community, real community, wherever we can. to replicate that indigenous people's model of how they look out for the people around them wherever we can. Um, like just like Gordon's kind of analogy there or his story there, I think if he had had people around him, even in those really dark times, that I think could uplift others, and we wouldn't think we need MAID. So maybe that's a little bit we can learn from the indigenous folks and come together. Let's create community where we can.
Great. All right, great. So should we pretty much close out the event?
Well, thank you everybody for coming. That was great. And hopefully we'll be able to hobnob together on other occasions. So have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bonne
Our
soirée.
pleasure.
Bonne soirée.
Merci.